March 18, 2004, Farmersville, Texas. 20-year-old Rachelle Lynne O'Neill Tollison spent her morning caring for her 6-month-old daughter. She was known for her kindness, her devotion to her baby, her bright smile that lit up the small community. By evening, she had vanished. Her infant daughter was found alone, crying in an empty house with the back door hanging open. 5 days later, searchers discovered Rachelle's body in a creek bed, burned, discarded like trash. The discovery shattered this quiet Texas town. But the arrest that followed 6 days later would shock them even more. The killer wasn't a stranger lurking in shadows, he was someone from Rachelle's past. Someone who had walked the same school halls, someone they trusted. Moises Sandoval Mendoza was sentenced to death in 2005, for 21 years, appeals dragged on while Rachelle's daughter grew up without her mother. Then, on April 23, 2025, justice finally arrived at the Huntsville unit. But was it enough to heal a family torn apart by betrayal? Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The morning started like any other in the small town of Farmersville. Spring had arrived early in Texas, and the air carried the scent of blooming wildflowers. Rachelle O'Neill Tollison moved through her daily routine with practiced ease, her 6-month-old daughter gurgling happily from her high chair. The sound of that laugh would haunt the family forever after this day. It was pure joy, innocent and trusting, the kind of sound that makes a mother's heart sing. Rachelle had always been devoted to her baby. Friends and neighbors often commented on how natural she seemed as a mother, how her face would light up whenever someone asked about her daughter. At 20 years old, she had found her purpose in life. The young woman who had once been uncertain about her future now had clarity. Everything revolved around this little person who depended on her completely. The house in Collin County was modest but comfortable. Rachelle had worked hard to make it a home, decorating the nursery with soft pastels and filling it with toys that sang lullabies. She took pride in keeping everything clean and organized, creating a safe haven for her daughter to grow and thrive. That morning, she fed the baby, changed her diaper, and played peekaboo until giggles filled the air. Around mid-morning, a neighbor saw Rachelle outside briefly. She waved, as she always did, her smile warm and genuine. It was the last time anyone would see her alive. The neighbor would replay that moment countless times in the years that followed, wondering if there had been any sign, any hint of the horror that was about to unfold. But there was nothing. Just Rachelle being Rachelle, kind and friendly, completely unaware that evil was already circling her peaceful world. As the day wore on, the house fell silent. The baby's cries eventually stopped, replaced by an eerie quiet that settled over the property like a shroud. By evening, something had gone terribly wrong, though no one knew it yet. The back door, which Rachelle always kept locked, stood open to the night air. Inside, chaos had replaced the morning's order. The next morning, Rachelle's mother arrived for a planned visit. She knocked on the front door, calling out her daughter's name. When no one answered, worry began to creep in. Rachelle was always punctual. Always reliable. She would never simply disappear without warning. The mother tried the door handle and found it unlocked, which sent the first spike of fear through her heart. Inside, the scene was wrong in every possible way. The baby sat alone in her crib, crying weakly from hunger and neglect. The mattress had been pulled from the bed and lay askew on the floor, clothes were scattered about, and personal belongings were strewn across the room as if someone had searched frantically for something. Most disturbing of all was the back door, hanging open like a mouth screaming into the void. Rachelle's mother scooped up her granddaughter, holding the infant close while her mind struggled to process what she was seeing. This was not like Rachelle. She would never leave her baby alone, not for any reason. The evidence of struggle was everywhere, written in displaced furniture and scattered possessions. With trembling hands, she called the police. The Collin County Sheriff's Office responded quickly. Deputies arrived to find a grandmother clutching a baby, both of them seeming impossibly small in the face of whatever had happened here. The officers began documenting the scene, taking photographs and collecting evidence. Every detail mattered now. The open door, the disturbed mattress, the items that seemed out of place, all of it would become crucial in the investigation that followed. As word spread through Farmersville, the community began to mobilize. This was a town where people looked out for each other, where everyone knew their neighbors and their neighbors' business. Rachelle's disappearance sent shockwaves through the close-knit population. Volunteers organized search parties, spreading out across fields and wooded areas, calling her name and hoping against hope for an answer. The local media picked up the story quickly. Rachelle's photograph appeared on television screens and newspaper front pages across North Texas. She looked so young in the pictures, so full of life and promise. The image of her smiling face became seared into the public consciousness, a symbol of innocence violated and safety shattered. Tips began pouring in, but most led nowhere. Prayer vigils formed spontaneously throughout the community. Churches opened their doors to grieving friends and neighbors who needed somewhere to gather, somewhere to make sense of the senseless. Candles flickered in the darkness as voices joined together in desperate supplication. They prayed for Rachelle's safe return, even as the evidence suggested that such prayers might already be too late. During the investigation, police began tracing Rachelle's connections and relationships. They interviewed friends, family members, and anyone who had recent contact with her. One name that emerged during these conversations was Moises Sandoval Mendoza, a man from Rachelle's past. He wasn't a stranger, which made his potential involvement even more disturbing. They had attended the same school, moved in similar circles, shared connections that went back years. As investigators dug deeper into Mendoza's background, a troubling picture began to emerge. He had a history of violence, a criminal record that painted him as someone capable of terrible things. The community began to buzz with rumors and speculation. How could someone they knew, someone who had walked among them, be capable of such evil? The betrayal cut deep, striking at the heart of everything they believed about their safe, small-town world. Fear spread through Farmersville like wildfire. If Mendoza was involved, then the danger had come from within their own community. Parents kept their children closer, neighbors eyed each other with new suspicion, and the easy trust that had defined their way of life began to erode. The investigation was closing in on answers, but those answers threatened to destroy everything they thought they knew about themselves. Meanwhile, Rachelle's family endured the torment of not knowing. Each day brought new hopes and fresh disappointments. Every phone call might bring news, every knock at the door could change everything. The baby continued to need care, and they rallied around her, determined to provide the love and stability she deserved even as their own world crumbled. Sleep became impossible. Food lost all taste. The simple act of breathing felt like a betrayal when Rachelle might be suffering somewhere beyond their reach. The breakthrough came on March 23, 2004. A search team combing the area near a creek bed made the discovery that everyone had been dreading. Human remains, partially concealed and showing signs of burning. The attempt to destroy evidence spoke to a consciousness of guilt that chilled investigators to the bone. Someone had not only taken Rachelle's life but had tried to erase every trace of her existence. The identification process confirmed what everyone already knew in their hearts: the remains were Rachelle's. The young mother who had started that March morning caring for her baby would never hold her daughter again. The news spread through Farmersville like a physical blow, dropping people to their knees and sending shockwaves through every home and business. Hope died that day, replaced by a grief so profound it seemed impossible to bear. The community wept openly. Grown men stood in their yards with tears streaming down their faces. Women collapsed into each other's arms, overwhelmed by the magnitude of loss. Children sensed the adults' distress and grew quiet, not understanding what had happened but feeling the weight of tragedy pressing down on everyone around them. Farmersville had been changed forever, marked by violence in a way that would never fully heal. Within hours of the discovery, police moved to arrest Mendoza. They found him and took him into custody on March 24, 2004. When confronted with the evidence, he denied kidnapping Rachelle, claiming instead that their encounter had been consensual. His version of events was not only insulting to her memory but flew in the face of all physical evidence. The forced entry, the signs of struggle, the ultimate disposal of her body, none of it supported his claims of consent. The arrest sent new shockwaves through the community. Seeing Mendoza in handcuffs, being led away by police, brought home the reality of betrayal in the starkest possible terms. This was someone they had known, someone who had seemed like just another member of their community. The revelation that he was capable of such monstrous acts shattered fundamental assumptions about human nature and the safety of small-town life. As prosecutors began building their case, the true scope of the crime became clear. Evidence of forced entry into Rachelle's home painted a picture of predatory violence. DNA evidence linked Mendoza to the scene. Witness statements placed him in the area at crucial times. His criminal history revealed a pattern of violence that had been escalating toward this ultimate act of brutality. The case against him was overwhelming, built on a foundation of scientific evidence and witness testimony that left little room for doubt. Rachelle's family prepared themselves for the ordeal of trial. The prospect of sitting in the same room as their daughter's killer, of listening to testimony about her final hours, was almost unbearable. But they were determined to see justice done, to ensure that Rachelle's voice was heard even in death. They would face Mendoza across the courtroom and demand accountability for what he had taken from them. The indictment for capital murder set the stage for a trial that would determine whether Mendoza would face the ultimate penalty for his crime. The death penalty was reserved for the most heinous offenses, and the prosecutors believed this case qualified without question. They had taken a young mother from her baby, destroyed a family, and traumatized an entire community. If that didn't warrant the ultimate punishment, then nothing did. As 2004 drew to a close, Farmersville tried to find ways to heal while still seeking justice. The trial was set for the following year, and everyone knew it would reopen wounds that had barely begun to heal. But they also knew it was necessary. Rachelle deserved nothing less than their complete commitment to seeing her killer held accountable. The road ahead would be long and painful, but they would walk it together, carrying her memory and
demanding justice in her name. When 2005 arrived, the trial began in earnest at the Collin County Courthouse. Jury selection revealed just how deeply the case had affected the local community. Finding 12 people who could be impartial proved challenging, as nearly everyone had heard about the case and formed opinions about Mendoza's guilt. The proceedings moved forward with a jury that understood the gravity of their responsibility. 12 citizens who would decide whether a man lived or died for his crimes. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They presented DNA evidence that placed Mendoza at the crime scene. Witness statements corroborated the timeline of events. Crime scene photographs showed the violence that had been inflicted on Rachelle and the callous way her body had been disposed of. Mendoza's criminal history was laid bare, revealing a pattern of escalating violence that had culminated in murder. The evidence painted a clear picture of what had happened on that March day. Mendoza had forced his way into Rachelle's home, likely with the intent to assault her. When she resisted, the encounter had turned deadly. Rather than call for help or accept responsibility, he had chosen to compound his crime by attempting to destroy the evidence. The burning of her body was perhaps the most callous aspect of the entire ordeal, an attempt to deny her family even the dignity of a proper burial. The defense team found themselves in an almost impossible position. The evidence against their client was overwhelming, and his own statements to police had created inconsistencies that were difficult to explain away. They attempted to argue that the encounter had begun as consensual, but this claim fell apart under scrutiny. The physical evidence of forced entry, the signs of struggle, and the ultimate disposal of the body all contradicted any notion of consent. As the trial progressed, the defense's arguments became increasingly desperate. They tried to create doubt about the DNA evidence, questioned the reliability of witnesses, and suggested alternative scenarios that might explain the facts. But each attempt was met with overwhelming contrary evidence. The jury listened skeptically as defense attorneys struggled to construct a narrative that would spare their client's life. The prosecution's closing argument was a masterpiece of legal advocacy. They walked the jury through every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every scientific finding that pointed to Mendoza's guilt. They painted a vivid picture of Rachelle's final hours, the terror she must have felt, and the complete lack of mercy shown by her attacker. They demanded justice not just for Rachelle, but for her baby daughter who would grow up without a mother, and for the community that had been traumatized by this senseless act of violence. The defense's closing plea was more about mercy than innocence. Faced with evidence that could not be disputed, they asked the jury to spare Mendoza's life, to choose life imprisonment over death.
They spoke of redemption and the possibility of change, but their words seemed hollow in the face of such overwhelming brutality. How do you ask for mercy for someone who showed none to his victim? The jury deliberated for hours, wrestling with the weight of their decision. They had to consider not just guilt or innocence, but whether the crime warranted the ultimate punishment. The evidence of guilt was clear, but the question of punishment required them to weigh factors of aggravation against any possible mitigation. In the end, they reached a unanimous verdict. When they returned to the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Rachelle's family held hands, preparing themselves for whatever came next. The jury foreman stood and delivered their verdict, guilty of capital murder. The words hit the courtroom like thunder, bringing relief and vindication to those who had suffered so much. Justice had been served, at least in terms of establishing guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. But the trial wasn't over. In capital cases, there is a separate penalty phase where the jury must decide between life imprisonment and death. This second deliberation would determine Mendoza's ultimate fate. The prosecution argued for death, citing the heinous nature of the crime, the complete lack of remorse, and the need to ensure that such evil never again threatened innocent people. The defense pleaded for life, asking the jury to show the mercy that their client had failed to demonstrate. After additional hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their punishment verdict, death. The sentence was met with quiet satisfaction from Rachelle's family. Justice had been served in the fullest sense possible under Texas law. Mendoza would pay for his crime with his own life, though it would be many years before that sentence would be carried out. As he was led away in shackles, the family felt a mixture of relief and sorrow. Nothing could bring Rachelle back, but at least her killer would face the ultimate consequence for his actions. The years that followed the trial were filled with the tedious process of appeals. Mendoza's lawyers filed motion after motion, challenging every aspect of his conviction and sentence. They argued ineffective assistance of counsel, claimed that evidence had been improperly admitted, and suggested that the jury had been biased. Each appeal was reviewed by state and federal courts, creating a legal process that dragged on for years. For Rachelle's family, each appeal was like reopening the wound. Just when they thought they could begin to heal, another legal filing would drag them back into the nightmare. They had to relive the testimony, review the evidence, and face the possibility that a court might overturn the verdict. The appeals process, while necessary to ensure justice, became its own form of torture for those who had already suffered so much. But the courts consistently upheld both the conviction and the death sentence. Appeal after appeal was denied, with judges finding no merit in the challenges raised by Mendoza's attorneys. The evidence had been properly obtained, the trial had been fair, and the jury's verdict was supported by overwhelming proof of guilt. Each denial brought the family one step closer to final closure, though it would be many more years before that closure would arrive. Meanwhile, Rachelle's daughter was growing up. The baby who had been found crying in her crib that terrible March day was becoming a young woman. She was surrounded by family members who poured their love into her, determined that she would know how much her mother had loved her. They told her stories about Rachelle, shared photographs and memories, and made sure she understood that her mother's absence was not by choice. Birthdays and holidays were bittersweet affairs. The family celebrated the milestones in the little girl's life, but there was always an empty chair at the table, a missing voice in the chorus of congratulations. They marked each passing year with both joy for the child's growth and grief for all that Rachelle was missing. The young woman who should have been there to see her daughter's first steps, first words, first day of school, was gone forever. As the years passed, Rachelle's daughter began to understand more about what had happened. The family was careful to share information in age-appropriate ways, helping her process the reality of her mother's death without overwhelming her young mind. She learned about the man who had taken her mother away, about the trial and the sentence, about the long wait for justice. Through it all, she remained surrounded by love and support from family members who were determined to honor Rachelle's memory by raising her daughter with care and devotion. The legal appeals continued through the 2010s and into the 2020s. Each filing was met with the same result, denial. The courts found no error in the original trial, no constitutional violation that would warrant overturning the verdict. Mendoza's guilt had been established beyond any reasonable doubt, and his sentence had been imposed according to law. The wheels of justice moved slowly. But they moved steadily toward the ultimate resolution. By 2024, the appeals process was finally nearing its end. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals had denied the final state appeal, and the federal courts had likewise rejected all challenges to the conviction. An execution date was set for April 23, 2025. After more than 20 years on death row, Mendoza would finally face the consequences of his actions. The family received the news with mixed emotions, relief that the long wait was finally ending, but also apprehension about the finality that was approaching. As the execution date drew near, the family had to prepare themselves emotionally for the last chapter of this long ordeal. Some members chose to witness the execution, feeling they needed to see justice carried out with their own eyes. Others decided to stay away, unable to bear watching another human being die, even one who had caused them so much pain. There was no right or wrong choice, only the need for each person to find their own way toward healing. On April 23, 2025, crowds gathered outside the Huntsville unit where Texas conducts its executions. Protesters and supporters held vigil, some calling for mercy and others demanding justice. Media crews set up cameras and prepared to document the end of a case that had captivated the region for more than 2 decades. Inside the prison walls, final preparations were being made for an execution that would close the book on one of Collin County's most heinous crimes. Rachelle's family members who chose to witness entered the death house with heavy hearts. They were escorted to the witness room where they would watch through a one-way window as the lethal injection was administered. The room was small and sterile, designed to minimize emotion and maintain order during the state's most solemn duty. They sat quietly, holding hands and drawing strength from each other as the final moments approached. In the execution chamber, Mendoza was strapped to a gurney and connected to IV lines that would deliver the fatal drugs. He was given an opportunity to make a final statement, his last chance to address the family he had wronged and the community he had traumatized. For the first time in more than 20 years, he offered a genuine apology, acknowledging the deep pain he had caused and expressing remorse for his actions. His words were too little, too late. 20 years of appeals, 20 years of legal challenges, 20 years of refusing to accept responsibility had drained any power his apology might have had. The family listened without emotion, unmoved by his attempt at contrition. They had waited too long, suffered too much, and sacrificed too many years to their pursuit of justice to be swayed by last-minute remorse. The warden gave the signal, and the lethal injection began. The drugs flowed through the IV lines, and within minutes, Mendoza was unconscious. A few minutes later, he was dead. The time of death was recorded as 6:41 p.m. Central Time on April 23, 2025. After 21 years, 2 months, and 1 day, justice had finally been served. The man who had taken Rachelle's life had paid for his crime with his own. The family left the prison quietly, declining to speak with the media gathered outside. They needed time to process what they had witnessed, to begin the long journey toward a different kind of healing. The execution had provided legal closure, but emotional healing would take much longer. They drove away from Huntsville knowing that while Mendoza was gone, Rachelle was still gone too. Justice had been served, but it could not restore what had been lost. Back in Farmersville, news of the execution spread quickly through the community. Some people felt a sense of closure, believing that justice had finally been served. Others reflected more somberly on the long journey that had brought them to this point. The crime had changed their community in fundamental ways, forcing them to confront the reality that evil could emerge from within their own midst. The execution marked an end to the legal proceedings, but the scars would remain forever. Vigils were held throughout the community to honor Rachelle's memory. People gathered in churches and parks, lighting candles and sharing memories of the young woman whose life had been cut so tragically short. Her photograph appeared once again on television screens and newspaper front pages, but this time the focus was on celebrating her life rather than mourning her death. She was remembered as a loving mother, a devoted daughter, and a bright light that had been extinguished far too soon. In the months that followed, Rachelle's daughter, now a young adult, began to speak publicly about her mother's legacy. She had grown up in the shadow of tragedy, but she had also been surrounded by love and support from family members who were determined to honor her mother's memory. She chose to use her voice to advocate against violence, to speak for other victims and their families, and to ensure that her mother's story would not be forgotten. Her public appearances were powerful and moving. She spoke with composure and strength, embodying the best of her mother's legacy while forging her own path forward. She talked about growing up without a mother, about the family that had rallied around her, and about the importance of never giving up on justice. Her words carried the weight of lived experience and the hope of someone who had survived unimaginable loss. The community rallied around her advocacy efforts, organizing events and fundraisers to support victims' rights organizations. Rachelle's story became a catalyst for broader conversations about violence against women, victim rights, and the importance of never giving up on justice. Her death had been a tragedy, but her family was determined that her legacy would be one of hope and positive change. As the first anniversary of the execution approached, the family organized a memorial gathering at the site where Rachelle's body had been found. The creek bed that had once been a place of horror and grief was transformed into a site of remembrance and hope. They planted flowers, placed a small monument, and held a ceremony that focused on celebrating Rachelle's life rather than dwelling on the manner of her death. The creek now flows more peacefully, bordered by the flowers that bloom each spring in Rachelle's memory. Visitors sometimes stop to pay their respects, leaving their own flowers or simply spending a few quiet moments reflecting on a life that ended far too soon. The site has become a place of pilgrimage for those touched by the story. A reminder that love endures even in the face of unthinkable tragedy. The legal case of Rachelle Lynne O'Neal Tollison officially closed with Mendoza's execution, but her story continues to resonate throughout Texas and beyond. Her case is studied in law schools as an example of how DNA evidence and persistent investigation can solve even the most challenging crimes. Her family's 20-year fight for justice has inspired other victims' families to never give up hope, even when the legal process seems interminable. Today, Rachelle's daughter continues her advocacy work, speaking at conferences and working with organizations dedicated to supporting crime victims and their families. She has channeled her grief into purpose, using her platform to honor her mother's memory while helping others navigate their own journeys toward healing and justice. Her strength and resilience serve as a testament to the power of love to overcome even the darkest circumstances. The community of Farmersville has also found ways to heal and move forward while never forgetting what happened. They have implemented new safety programs, strengthened community watch organizations, and created support networks for families dealing with crime and loss. The tragedy that once threatened to tear them apart has ultimately made them stronger and more connected to one another. Rachelle's story reminds us that justice, while sometimes slow, can ultimately prevail. Her case demonstrates the importance of never giving up on the pursuit of truth, even when the path forward seems impossibly difficult. The 21 years between crime and execution were long and painful for her family, but they never stopped believing that justice would eventually be served. In the end, Rachelle Lynne O'Neal Tollison is remembered not for the violence of her death, but for the love she gave in her 20 years of life. She is remembered as a devoted mother who would have done anything to protect her daughter. She is remembered as a kind and caring person who lit up the lives of everyone who knew her. She is remembered as someone whose death became a rallying cry for justice and whose legacy continues to inspire positive change. Her daughter carries that legacy forward every day, living a life that honors her mother's memory while creating her own path toward the future. She has refused to be defined by tragedy, choosing instead to be shaped by the love and support of the family that raised her and the strength she inherited from a mother she barely got to know. In her voice, Rachelle's spirit lives on, ensuring that her story will never be forgotten and that her fight for justice will inspire others for generations to come. The case that began with a missing mother and a crying baby has become a story of resilience, determination, and the enduring power of love to overcome even the darkest evil. Justice was served, healing has begun, and love endures. In the end, that may be
the most important lesson of all.